Hello, and welcome back to the Mr. Kriz classroom. As you can see, we've got a bit of an update in our gear, so we're going to test it out, see how we go. Today we are doing a quick little crash course in Agency and Control to prepare us for our upcoming SACs and exams, which are only in a couple months. So let's get us started. So what we're going to do today is we're going to quickly kind of break down the key knowledge points. I'm going to go through some practice questions from previous exams. Now, just to keep in mind, these are from the previous study design. So some things might be different, but overall it is pretty much the same. There's only been a couple tweaks in the key knowledge points. And we're kind of just going to break down a couple of the questions in terms of marking criteria and maybe the best ways we can go ahead at answering those questions. So, just a reminder, one of the big things about this course is audience agency, hence the term agency and control. Obviously, if we have a look at this flowchart that is from our Media Reframed textbook, we can kind of see the development of audience agency. With the introduction of Web 2.0, there was a lot more control back in the day, but now when there's a lot more user-generated content, we have a lot more agency as audiences to be creators and consumers. Obviously, there are also a few little areas where things do become a little bit grey with audience agency, which we can see at the bottom. Here are our key knowledge points now. At the bottom, we have to use our media language. So that is always a key part in a lot of these questions. It's just pretty much common knowledge that we are using our media language. If we're not using our correct media language, especially in agency and control, the terminology that we've been used to using and correctly identifying certain platforms, like social media, print media, identifying our media forms, we need to make sure that we are using this correct media language. So we're going to start off with key knowledge point 1 and key knowledge point 2. So here we have the changing relationship between media and audiences, and we also have the influence of both media and audiences. So just to start with, we're going to start with our key knowledge point 1. As a reminder, the past, there was a lot more control, like I already said, but now as we've come into the present, there is a lot more agency in what we can consume and what we can produce ourselves as our audience. And there's a term that I'll be using a little bit, it's called, we are a prosumer. So we are a producer and we are also a consumer, because in the world of user-generated content, we consume, but we also create content, just like this. So there is always something we can consider with this, and that is the feedback loop. So obviously we have the traditional feedback loop, which was there was the media, they sent a message, their audiences then received that, they reacted to it, and then the media responded to those reactions, and was a cycle. If we're looking at things like the news, things like that, we can see that here. Now, obviously, there has been a change with the user-generated content. But if we have a look over here, we can see that with the user-generated content that has come into play, our feedback loop comes almost in like a feedback figure eight, because audiences can intercept messages, then respond to those messages, then audiences can respond to those messages, and it can be almost an infinite loop. So if we kind of look at the world of social media with like TikTok and Instagram, where people are recreating videos or they are remixing videos for their own purposes, and their own reactions for their fan bases, for people who share similar values, similar social contexts. That is where we can consider this feedback loop. And this is something we can refer to in our examples when we're answering questions. If we're referring to this modern day feedback loop of how audiences are intercepting messages, that is something you can talk about. So here we have an example question. So this one is from the 2020 VCE media exam. Now again, just a reminder, this is an old study design, however, most of it is pretty similar. So with this, they're asking you to discuss the dynamic relationship between media and audiences. And one of the main things that they've got there is the terms production and consumption. So here, this is where we can talk about our term being a prosumer. Now, there are a couple of things. Let's break down how we're going to get our marks. So obviously, one of the first things we can do is we can identify. So what are we identifying? We are identifying the dynamic relationship. We are identifying any sort of arguments or ideas about media influence. We can then discuss this in further detail to get 2 more marks. From there, we can, if we provide specific examples, so from here we can talk about user-generated content, we can talk about other areas within that to show, okay, is there a specific example from TikTok or from Instagram, YouTube, some sort of social media that we can use? And obviously you're going to get those marks for your media language. I'm going to harp on about that because you need to use your media language. So here is an example. If you want to read it, you can pause the video, but this is a high scoring example from the 2020 exam. A student wrote this, and when we have a look at it, you can kind of see the areas that they've done. They've spoken about modern influencers, they've spoken about Web 2.0, they've spoken about some other sort of things, and with like PewDiePie and those kind of social media influencers. Within that though, they have also referred to media theory, and that is something I'm going to touch on a little bit at the end. If you want to, you can pause it, you can read it, have a look at it. Next key knowledge point, we've got the influence of both media and audiences. And within that, we can see how the term media, it can refer to a variety of things. So it can refer to companies, it can refer to institutions, it can also refer to individuals, especially when we're looking at social media influencers. We can also, with this, there's also, I've already said it, but the growing influence of audiences and their audience agency. Again, we've got another example here. This is a 10 marker from the 2021 VCE media exam. And now obviously with the 10 markers have changed now. They are now 15 markers in your section B. So, but they still require about the same amount of in-depth analysis. So you really want to analyze, show a lot of information, show a lot of resources, and things like that. If you're struggling to structure it, think of it like an English essay. You go for the teal structure. So obviously that's an easy way to break it down, because then you can identify easily what you're going to talk about, your explanation, your evidence, and then link it all back. So you also want to make sure that you are accurate in your responses, using those media theories, using that media language, and that is the kind of things that you want to include. Pick 1 or 2 things to analyze, and analyze it deeply rather than picking small little things, because if you go deeper in your analysis, you'll get those marks. Now, here is a high marking response. This was one that received the full 10 marks. As you can see, it is very detailed. If you want to have a quick read of it, highlight, pick out the key things, you can. Just pause the video here. I've given you a chance. We're going to move on. So we're going to move on to our third key knowledge point. So how media is used by globalized institutions, governments, and individuals. Now, this is something that is extensive. In my classes, remember we spoke about Dumb Ways to Die campaign, because that is something that is used by a whole range of people, and is something that we can really link to a lot of other areas, especially like Australian media regulation and things like that. All right, so these are a few ways that institutions, governments, and individuals can use it. So obviously we've got here with institutions, they've got personalized algorithms, they've got that idea of surveillance capitalism, which, if you want more information, that is also in our media reframe textbook. There's also this idea of X now, which is Twitter, being kind of this idea of the world's town square. So we can really talk about the influence that Elon Musk had in the acquiring of Twitter and now X, and how it has changed over time. With governments as well, you can talk about how they use social media for support. If we think about in 2022, the Liberals, they used social media, they used a tune, There's a Hole in My Bucket, Dear Labour, which garnered a lot of response. There were remixes made, people were making jokes about it, but that was a way that they used social media to connect with their voters. You can even also talk about how the Victorian government, they used TAC to create ad campaigns to reduce road crashes, to really spread the information of road safety. As well with that, we can talk about Dumb Ways to Die. So that is something that an institution and the government use, as well then responded to by individuals. Governments also regulate what audiences can view. So that's when we can tie it into media regulation. With individuals, they create followings on social media. the term prosumers, we're back with that. They have the influence over fan bases. So recently there's the whole Chapel Roan debate about what fans expect from celebrities, and there's a lot of discourse about that, with her coming out saying about the creepy stalker behaviour that's not on, but she's more than happy to take photos and sign autographs when she's on the clock. So there's a lot of discourse about that. People are now arguing that she signed up for it, but there's now a lot of discourse about what is creepy fan behaviour, what is suitable. So that's something else you can talk about. We have an example question here that is from the 2019 VCE media exam, and this one is asking you about media institutions and the effect that they've had on the contemporary media, and how users exercise their agency. So it's a 4-marker. There's not a lot that you need. Really, you're just going for, again, so you want to identify what the effect is. You also want to identify or discuss the effect that you want to discuss the effect in further detail. This is where you can provide examples, and then we go into our media language as well. So you want all that. Here we have another high scoring response. As you can see, this is very detailed, but they put in enough detail to get those 4 marks. You can pause here if you want to read. We also have an example here of how governments use media. This is from the 2022 media exam. Now this is only a 3-marker. It's not asking for as much detail, but we still want to identify how it is used by governments, discuss it, and then also provide a specific example. Within that, we are still using our media language. So if we're not using our media language, we might still not get those 3 marks. So again, here we have an example. This one isn't as much writing, but as we can see, it is still rather detailed in what they answer with. So now what we're going to be looking at is some arguments, evidence, and examples that we can use to discuss influence and audience agency. So here we do have a few examples where there are some things that we can talk about. Again, this is from the textbook. So we do have those personalized algorithms that we can talk about, especially with the terms like filter bubbles, and we can look at TikTok. There is the Wall Street Journal article that you can talk about where they did an investigation into filter bubbles and rabbit holes within the TikTok algorithm, and there are those kinds of things. So to get us started, some things that you can talk about, of course, are Web 2.0 and the introduction of user-generated content. That is a pretty broad topic that you can talk about, and it allows you to talk about all kinds of things relating to social media and things like that. We also have, you've got, again, social medias allowing for greater audience agency, tying into that user-generated content. You can then also discuss the idea of audiences being prosumers. Again, that term, producers and consumers. You can then talk about how audiences have had an impact in influencing areas of media. One example that you can talk about is the Sonic redesign. When they released the trailer for the movie, there was a very negative response from fans, and there was outrage, and within a matter of days, even 24 hours, there was a response from the creators. They paused the production, and they redesigned the whole Sonic character to make it more fitting and cartoony to reflect the initial source material. So you've got those kinds of things. We also have influencers and celebrities influencing audiences. So there are things that you can talk about, like recently there was Cristiano Ronaldo who started a YouTube channel, within a matter of days hit almost 50 million subscribers, being one of the most influential people in the world. You can also talk about Mr. Beast being the most subscribed YouTuber in the world, and with his Team C's and Team Trees movements, influencing audiences to donate and help clean up the ocean, plant trees, and be a positive influence. We also have the influence that media companies have. So obviously you've got TikTokers gaining overnight success and creating a career. There's lots of different people. You can talk about Charli D'Amelio, Addison Rae, even people like Tate McRae. There's heaps of other people, but obviously those artists are some of the more influential ones. We also have social media personalized algorithms like we were talking about. So again, you've got the Wall Street Journal investigation in 2021 where they investigated TikTok's algorithms, and the algorithms being very personalized and almost rabbit holing audiences into specific areas. There is also the idea of surveillance capitalism. So everything that we do online is being watched. data being collected. You've got Google stealing data in 2009. You also have Google using street cam footage in 2010 as an example to create and build a database. Within that, you can also talk about AI. There's a lot of issues around AI stealing content to train their models. Things like Adobe Stock was under a lot of fire because of that. So there are things you can talk about with that. There is also within this Dumb Ways to Die, the whole Dumb Ways to Die campaign allowed for a lot of discussion within the spreadability theory. You can talk about that, how it's spread, how audiences engaged with that, and things like that. We're going to move on to regulation of the media, and we're going to look at it within the Australian lens. So this is a major thing. There are going to be questions which do talk about Australian regulation media. So I'm going to move over. So as we can see, this is a table of reasons why we do regulate media, but some of the main things are about mainly protecting audiences. So you've got protecting children from content that might disturb them or might be too mature. You've got about protecting cultural identity, and there's a few other things there as well. So you can pause it and have a read. So here we've got ways that media in Australia is regulated. You've got your ACMA, you've got your National Classification Scheme, you've got the Advertising Standards Bureau, and these are all things that you can talk about and use as examples in your questions, in your answers, to talk about Australian regulation media. So what you can do is you can combine these two tables. You can give the reasons or the ways that media is regulated, and then you can give the reasons as to why it is regulated. So for example, you could talk about the National Classification Scheme and how certain things are classified, given specific ratings to protect younger audiences. So you could talk about MA movies, films, TV shows, video games, and those kinds of content as well. So here we do have an example from the 2023 exam last year, which does ask us about self-regulation. So you need to be mindful that you can't just talk about industry regulation. You can't talk about institutions such as these government bodies such as ACMA, the National Classification Scheme. They might ask you about self-regulation. So when you're looking at how audiences can regulate themselves, you can also, within self-regulation, you can look at how companies are regulating their own staff. If we're looking at maybe news, broadcasting channels, papers, they have certain self-regulations that journalists have to follow. So in this, you've got your self-regulation. They're asking you by media institutions. So when we're talking about media institutions, that's when we're talking about news sites. And it also asks you how they maintain these standards through regulatory codes of conduct. The ways that we can get our marks for this. So 1, identify the example. So as we can see, it's only 4 marks. So, but we still want that detail. You want to describe the rationale. So you want to make sure, as you're reading the questions, pick out those keywords. So obviously you need to provide the example. You need to, what is the rationale? So you then also have to give detail about that specific example, and then obviously you're going to get your marks for that media language. So that is ways that you can do that. Now here we do have an example. You can pause and have a look at it and just see how they have answered this, gotten those full marks. As you can see, again, even though for a full marker, it is still relatively detailed. What we are going to now move on to are these issues and challenges with regulating media. We can look at this within a local setting, within Australia. We can also look at it in terms of a wider setting. We can look at it globally, again, looking at social media, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram. We can look at those kinds of sites. Even things like Twitch and now X as well have been providing some issues within regulating certain areas to protect their audiences. So some of the things we can look at is generative AI. So obviously there are a lot of issues with governments regulating. There isn't a lot of regulation on it. However, there are some laws that are trying to be passed. The Australian government is starting to look at, or have been looking at, how they can regulate media. We also have, you can talk about some of the issues surrounding these generative AIs. Obviously, when Gemini, Google's AI, was first released, there was a lot of issues there with it providing misinformation. For example, telling people to put glue on pizzas, eat rocks, those kinds of things. It was very, very poorly designed at the time. They took it back and they have worked on it and they have developed it to try and not spread that misinformation. However, that is the issue with AI. There's a lot of misinformation that comes around. There's also, you can talk about maybe some issues about AI and blurring the lines of what are images, because there are a lot of issues with AI stealing content. There are a couple examples where photographers have won competitions with AI, and there was one Australian competition that was run and someone won with AI. They didn't accept the prize. They were trying to see what would happen. And so they did win. There's also some issues if we're looking a little more internationally. There was the Pokemon trading card game. They ran a competition for artwork, and there was a clear distinction between some of the artwork, and there was a lot of AI generated artwork put under certain pseudonyms by certain people, and so there was a lot of issues coming around that. We also have Australian media regulation and the issues of regulating Australian media within the public space, within free to air. There has to be a certain quota that is met. So within a year, there have to be at least 55% of Australian content aired onto free to air TV. With the introduction of streaming services, this has become an issue as it is very saturated with international content, and there are a lot of issues with Australian content being overshadowed and on streaming services not meeting this quota. So there's a lot of regulatory issues surrounding that. We also have issues with regulating misinformation and hate speech, especially on sites such as X. There's also a lot of issues on YouTube and things like that with regulating what is appropriate, and not a lot is being done to protect their audiences. So this is an example from the 2020 VCE Media exam. This is another Section B question, a 10 marker, which reminder they are now 15 markers, but you are still expected to give a deep analysis into the questions. It's asking you to analyze one or more issues talking about regulation and control of the media. Within the question, it also discusses crossing national borders and governments. So this is where we can talk about those international companies such as YouTube and those other social media platforms. Now within this, again, it's given you an option to talk about one or more. Again, same as the other 10 marker that we mentioned before, you want to try keep it to one or two ideas. If you can have multiple ideas that kind of link, then that is okay. So if you want to talk about regulating on YouTube and regulating on TikTok, they're two different examples because they're two different platforms. They tie under the one kind of umbrella. You can talk about that. You also want to make sure that you are putting in enough detail otherwise and using that media language, otherwise you're not going to get marks. So on the next slide here we can see we do have an example of a high scoring answer. So with this example there is a deep analysis into YouTube and how they have handled certain hate speech. You can have a read of it, have a look, see how they've formatted it, structured it. All right, we're going to move on. So the last area to talk about are the ethical and legal issues within media. Now, this is kind of stuff that we have touched base on already a little bit. So I have included some other examples that we've already spoken about here. So we've got some generative AI stuff. We've got some the issues within regulating hate speech. Some other things that you can discuss is data harvesting. So TikTok has been known for data harvesting. If you are searching on websites within TikTok, it has been known that they are tracking everything you do, as well as they have been expected to do keylogging, which is that idea. So tracking everything you type and search within TikTok. Now, TikTok have said they haven't been keylogging, but there's still some debate whether they are or not. So there are some, if you want to have a look in your Media Reframe textbook, there are further examples that you can talk about. So it is on page 531 to 539. There are plenty of examples of this stuff on conspiracy theories and things like that. So here we do have an example from the 2018 exam. So this one is a 6 marker, so it's asking for a little bit more detail than some of our other questions that we've looked at. Now with this, obviously the same thing again, you want to identify the ethical and legal issue that's going to get you your mark. You are then going to identify, with this specific question, it's asked you to talk about the production, distribution, consumption, or reception. So you have to pick one of those things. Now, you have to keep in mind, it's asking for you to talk about one of those things. You can't talk about more than one, otherwise you will not get the marks. you will only get marks for the first thing you talk about. So if you don't talk about it in enough detail, you probably won't get a lot of marks. The next thing you do want to talk about as well is you want to describe the issue a little bit more in detail. You're then going to provide the specific example to back up what you were talking about, and then obviously you're going to get your mark for your media language. So this is another example answer. Again, pause it, read it, have a look at it. So the last thing I quickly want to touch base on is media theories. Now, all of this information is available for my students on our style page, so you can access that. But just as a bit of a recap, it is important that you do talk about these media theories in your analyses to give you that extra edge to get those marks and to really support what you were talking about. It is important that you're referring to them correctly as well. So to start with, we have our two-step flow theory, which is the idea of media being passed down through a hierarchical chain. You've got your opinion leaders. They're the ones that they are passing on the message to the audiences and almost telling people how they should respond. So this is something that we can see quite heavily with influencers and celebrities. The next one we've got is cultivation theory. So this is the idea that what we view on any form of media, whether it is social media, film, TV, we believe this is the idea of what the world is. So if we see a lot of one thing in a TV show, then we think that, that's common. The next theory I want to touch base on is reinforcement theory. So it's the idea that the media that we consume kind of reinforces what we believe in, our cultural beliefs, our ideas, our thoughts. And it focuses on how individuals limit the information they accept. So if it doesn't align with our own beliefs, we're not going to accept it, we're going to reject the idea. There is also the agenda setting theory. So rather than telling us what we should think, it's telling us how we should think about what we should think about. So it focuses on the idea that there are certain messages that might be relayed out by certain media companies, news programs can be gatekeepers in information because there might be things that they do not find appropriate. We then have some more modern theories. So we do have this idea of spreadability theory, which is the idea that audiences have the agency to spread certain bits of information. So with this, we think about any form of like memes or viral trends, it can even relate it to Dumb Ways to Die and how within a week it became one of the most viewed and viral PSAs in the world. So those are things you can talk about with spreadability theory. We also have the idea of filter bubbles. So filter bubbles are the idea that we are kind of shoeboxed into different pockets of the internet based on our own kind of activity. So this is where we get into that algorithms within certain social media sites on YouTube, TikTok, and kind of being pigeonholed, shoehorned into specific pockets of the internet. The final one is this idea of parasocial relationships. So again, parasocial relationships are this idea of almost like a one-way relationship between an audience and an influencer or a celebrity. So if we can think about Twitch, we can think about YouTube and social media, comment sections, live feeds, and kind of getting a response from those people and kind of feel like that we are a part of them. We have some sort of relationship with them. There's a lot of like stan culture that is supported by that. You can look at like BTS stans, Taylor Swift stans, who really aren't loud. Even like the whole One Direction, there's a lot we can unpack about One Direction and kind of their stan culture. And this is where we get also into the conversation about what Chapel Roan was saying recently. So there's a lot that you can talk about parasocial relationships in terms of social media and things like that. So that is the end of this quick crash course. I hope you found it informative. If you have any questions, please let me know down in the comments, and I hope to see you next time in the Mr. Kriz classroom.